Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a period when the lines between power and utter depravity blurred into a terrifying, often darkly comedic, mess. Imagine, if you will, the flickering torchlight in ancient Roman palaces, the scent of exotic spices mingling with something less savory, perhaps the faint, metallic tang of fear, or the lingering aroma of last night's utterly insane banquet. You're not just an observer tonight. You're an unseen presence, a shadow flitting through the marbled halls, witnessing the private horrors and public spectacles of kings who took the concept of absolute power corrupts absolutely and ran with it, straight off a cliff, usually dragging an entire empire behind them. You're going to meet some truly shocking characters, folks whose bedtime stories involve things that would make your average villain from a B-movie blush. Honestly, you probably won't survive this journey with your illusions intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our first stop on this grand tour of royal weirdness takes us to the heart of the Roman Empire, to a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, though you'll know him better by his chilling nickname, Caligula. Picture him as a boy, growing up in the shadow of his formidable family. His father, Germanicus, was a beloved general, a Roman hero. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was equally respected. Yet, despite this seemingly noble lineage, something festered beneath the surface. You see, young Gaius earned his nickname, Caligula, which means little boot, from the miniature military boots he wore as a child, trotting around army camps with his dad. Cute, right? Almost wholesome, you might think. But that innocent image would soon be shattered, replaced by a legacy of sheer, unadulterated madness. As he matured, Caligula was thrust into the viper's nest of the imperial court under his great-uncle, the Emperor Tiberius. Now, Tiberius himself was no picnic. He was a suspicious, often cruel ruler who retreated to the island of Capri in his later years, reportedly indulging in some truly grotesque private activities. Historians still argue whether Tiberius actively corrupted Caligula, or if the young man already possessed a latent darkness simply waiting for the opportunity to bloom. What we do know is that Caligula watched, learned, and perhaps simmered with his own twisted ambitions. He survived Tiberius's purges by feigning idiocy, playing the part of a harmless, pliable youth. Imagine the internal struggle, the constant performance, the sheer nerve it must have taken to maintain that facade while knowing your life hung by a thread. It's like being in the world's most dangerous improv class, where the consequence of a bad performance is, well, permanently leaving the stage. When Tiberius finally shuffled off this mortal coil in 37 AD, Caligula, surprisingly, was initially embraced by the Roman people. They were tired of Tiberius's reclusive tyranny and saw in Caligula the son of a hero, a fresh face. He started well, too, abolishing a hated sales tax and bringing back exiles. For a brief moment, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. But the honeymoon period, like a cheap toga, quickly frayed. Within months, a severe illness struck Caligula. We're not sure what it was. Some say a fever, others an epileptic fit. But whatever its nature, it seemed to flip a switch in his brain. The mild-mannered, if perhaps cunning, young man who had ascended the throne vanished, replaced by a paranoid, megalomaniacal tyrant with a penchant for the truly bizarre. This is where our story really begins to veer into the "you can't make this stuff up" territory. You start to hear whispers, then outright pronouncements, that Caligula believed himself a god. Not just a divine emperor, which was a common enough conceit in Rome, but a living god demanding worship. He'd dress as various deities, Jupiter, Apollo, even Venus, and expect people to prostrate themselves before him. You can almost feel the collective eye roll across the empire, quickly followed by a shiver of genuine fear. How do you tell your emperor, politely, that he's not, in fact, the goddess of love, especially when he's holding a lightning bolt prop? You don't, obviously. You bow. And you pray he doesn't decide to strike you down for a perceived lack of devotion. This divine delusion fueled his most infamous acts of perversion and cruelty. His palace became a stage for his increasingly erratic behavior. He reportedly had incestuous relations with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he treated as his wife and even declared a goddess upon her death. The opulence was beyond anything seen before, but it was tainted by an atmosphere of constant threat and bizarre ritual. Dinners at the palace weren't just meals. They were performances, often ending with someone being led away to their death for a perceived slight or simply to amuse the emperor. The laughter in those halls must have had a truly hollow ring. As you continue your ethereal wanderings through the imperial palace, you notice the whispers growing louder, the fear more palpable. Caligula's reign, though short, was a masterclass in capricious terror. He famously appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, to be a consul, or at least he threatened to. Imagine the scene. Roman senators, men of immense power and dignity, standing around a stable, trying to figure out if the emperor was serious about giving a horse a top political job. You can almost hear the nervous coughs, the clinking of hoarse brass, and the desperate attempts to decipher the madness. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine intention or a deliberate, cruel joke to humiliate the Senate and demonstrate his absolute power. Either way, it was a power move that reeked of unstable genius, or just unstable. His cruelty wasn't limited to symbolic gestures. Caligula delighted in public executions, often prolonging the agony of his victims. He'd force parents to watch their children being tortured and then executed, a truly grotesque spectacle designed not just to punish, but to utterly break the spirit of anyone who might dare to defy him. One particularly chilling anecdote tells of him ordering an arena full of spectators to be thrown to the beasts because there weren't enough condemned criminals to provide entertainment. Talk about a bad audience review. You probably wouldn't want to get on his bad side after that. Financially, Caligula was a disaster. He inherited a treasury bulging with money left by Tiberius, but he squandered it on lavish projects, decadent banquets, and insane personal whims. He built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae just so he could ride his horse across it, disproving an astrologer's prophecy that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. Mission accomplished, I guess, but at what cost? A massive one, involving the diversion of grain ships and contributing to a famine in Rome. It's the ancient equivalent of someone buying a private jet just to prove a point to their high school math teacher. But even a reign of such outrageousness eventually hits a wall. The sheer scale of his depravity and unpredictability united a diverse group against him. Disgruntled senators, Praetorian guardsmen who feared for their lives, and even members of his own household. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula was assassinated by a conspiracy led by Cassius Chaerea, an officer of the Praetorian Guard. As he was leaving a public games event, he was cornered in a secret passageway and stabbed multiple times. His wife, Milonia Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, were also murdered, ensuring no direct heirs remained. The Roman people, who had once welcomed him, now cheered his death. His statues were pulled down, his name struck from public record. It was a swift, brutal end to a reign that felt less like governance and more like a fever dream. Our journey through history's more peculiar monarchs next leads us to another Roman emperor who shared Caligula's flair for the dramatic, though with a different artistic bent. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or simply Nero. If Caligula was the capricious, unstable god-king, Nero was the flamboyant, insecure artist tyrant. You find yourself now amidst the opulent, gold-leafed halls of his Domus Aurea, his golden house, a monument to his colossal ego built over the ashes of Rome. Born into the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero was adopted by his great-uncle, Emperor Claudius, largely due to the machinations of his ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger. She was a force to be reckoned with, and it's said she poisoned Claudius to put her son on the throne when he was just 16. Nero, initially, was guided by his tutors, the philosopher Seneca the Younger and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, and his early reign showed promise. He reduced taxes, banned rigged gladiatorial games, and even championed the rights of slaves. You might think, hey, maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. But then, the artistic bug, and more importantly, the power bug, began to bite hard. Nero saw himself as a magnificent artist, a poet, a musician, a charioteer, a tragedian. He loved performing, a passion considered undignified for a Roman emperor. He would force senators and nobles to attend his lengthy recitals, sometimes lasting for days, and applaud enthusiastically, even if they were dying of boredom. Imagine being stuck at a really bad open mic night, but instead of just politely clapping, your life literally depends on you looking enthralled. It's enough to make you long for a good old-fashioned gladiatorial combat. His mother, Agrippina, however, was a constant shadow, trying to control him. Nero, chafing under her influence, eventually decided to eliminate her. This wasn't a quiet affair. He tried poisoning her, but she survived. Then he tried to drown her in a specially designed collapsible boat. Yes, a boat built to fall apart. But she swam to shore. Finally, in 59 AD, he sent assassins to stab her to death. This act, the murder of his own mother, was a turning point. It stripped away any remaining veneer of normalcy and signaled his descent into paranoia and unchecked tyranny. The Roman historian Tacitus suggests Nero then viewed her corpse, remarking on her beauty, which is a truly disturbing thought. The most famous, or infamous, event of Nero's reign is, of course, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire raged for 6 days, destroying much of the city. While the popular legend depicts Nero fiddling while Rome burned, it's more likely he was playing his lyre and singing, but the core idea of his detachment from the suffering of his people holds. He was reportedly more concerned with the aesthetic opportunities the fire presented, using the cleared land to build his extravagant Domus Aurea. Historians still argue whether Nero deliberately started the fire to make way for his palace, or if it was an accident he capitalized on. Regardless, the public blamed him, and to deflect suspicion, Nero scapegoated a then small, obscure sect. You can almost feel the heat radiating from the ashes of Rome as you follow the phantom footsteps of Nero, the scent of smoke still clinging to the fabric of time. His persecution of Christians was particularly brutal. He'd have them covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or crucified, or even set ablaze to serve as human torches illuminating his garden parties. Imagine the flickering light on marble statues, the sounds of revelry, and the horrific screams in the background. It's a macabre tableau that defines the depths of his cruelty, blending entertainment with terror. Nero's self-indulgence wasn't just about palace building, it extended to his personal life. He had several wives, but his affections were often directed elsewhere, sometimes towards men, sometimes towards women in ways that shocked even the notoriously liberal Roman society. His relationship with a freedman named Sporus, whom he castrated and then married in a public ceremony, even dressing him as a woman, was particularly scandalous. He called Sporus Sabina, after his deceased wife, Poppaea Sabina, whom he had supposedly kicked to death while she was pregnant. It's a bizarre and tragic footnote that reveals a king deeply entangled in his own twisted desires, blurring the lines between private fantasy and public display. His artistic ambitions grew increasingly insatiable. He would perform in public, not just in Rome but also in Greece, where he participated in the Olympic Games and other festivals. Naturally, he won every competition, often by rigging the results or intimidating his opponent. Imagine competing in the ancient Olympics, only to find out your opponent is the emperor, and losing means, well, losing your head. It probably wasn't a very level playing field, you might say. These grand tours emptied the imperial treasury further, leading to increased taxes and resentment among the populace. He was draining Rome's coffers faster than a sieve drains water, all for the sake of his ego and an utterly bizarre form of performance art. Eventually, Nero's extravagant excesses and brutal purges of perceived enemies, including his former tutor Seneca, led to widespread revolt. The governors of several provinces, including Hispania and Gaul, rose up against him. The Praetorian Guard, his own elite bodyguard, deserted him. Finding himself utterly abandoned and declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled Rome. On June 9, 68 AD, with loyal freedmen urging him to take his own life to avoid capture and a humiliating execution, he reportedly exclaimed, "Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me!" He then, with the assistance of his secretary Epaphroditus, managed to stab himself in the throat. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, ushering in a period of civil war. Historians still argue whether Nero's final words were a testament to his delusional self-importance or a moment of tragic irony. Our next monarch of mayhem takes us back to Rome, but this time to a later, equally bewildering period, with an emperor whose reign lasted barely 4 years but managed to pack in enough scandal for a lifetime. You drift through time, past the Flavian dynasty and the Antonines, landing squarely in the early 3rd century AD, amidst the swirling incense and clashing cymbals of a very different imperial court. Say hello to Varius Avitus Bassianus, better known as Elagabalus. Now, if you thought Caligula and Nero were wild, Elagabalus was like a hyperactive teenager given the keys to the entire Roman Empire and told, "Have at it." He ascended to the throne at the tender age of 14 in 218 AD, thanks to the machinations of his powerful grandmother, Julia Maesa, and his mother, Julia Soaemias. He was not, in fact, an emperor in the traditional sense, but rather the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabal in Emesa, Syria, a cult imported directly into the heart of Rome. Imagine a boy king, more interested in spiritual fervor and shocking rituals than governing an empire. It's like sending a teenager to run a Fortune 500 company, but the teenager is also convinced he's the living embodiment of a fiery desert god. From the moment he arrived in Rome, Elagabalus began to dismantle traditional Roman religious practices, attempting to replace Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with his own sun deity, Elagabal. He had the sacred black stone representing Elagabal brought to Rome and placed in a magnificent new temple on the Palatine Hill. You can almost hear the collective gasp of the traditional Roman senators, watching their ancient gods being sidelined by a foreign rock. He even tried to marry Elagabal to various Roman goddesses, including Minerva and Vesta, the virgin goddess of the hearth, much to the horror of the Vestal virgins themselves. It's like trying to force a royal marriage between a beloved family pet and a priceless antique vase, utterly inappropriate and slightly insane. His personal life was even more outlandish than his religious reforms. Elagabalus was reportedly gender-fluid or transgender, dressing in women's clothing, wearing elaborate makeup, and openly engaging in same-sex relationship. He was said to have worked as a prostitute in the palace, and even offered vast sums of money to any doctor who could give him female genitalia. This wasn't just sexual liberation, it was a deliberate, provocative assault on Roman societal norms, which were rigid about gender roles and sexual conduct, especially for an emperor. He took a male chariot driver, Hierocles, as his husband, and referred to himself as Hierocles' wife. Historians still argue about the precise nature of his gender identity and sexual orientation, but what is clear is that his expressions were revolutionary and deeply shocking to the Roman elite. As you observe Elagabalus's reign, you can almost taste the scandal lingering in the air, thick as the incense from his exotic rituals. His lavish banquets were legendary, not just for their opulence but for their sheer absurdity. He was known to serve peacock brains and flamingos' tongues, delicacies so expensive and rare they were a deliberate insult to the struggling Roman populace. He'd reportedly release panthers and lions among his unsuspecting dinner guests, causing widespread panic for his amusement. Imagine sitting down for a nice meal, perhaps enjoying a bit of roasted wild boar, and suddenly realizing you're sharing the room with a very hungry big cat. It makes for excellent dinner theater, but probably not great digestion. He even had a habit of inviting 8 bald men, 8 men with gout, and 8 deaf men to dinner, just for the novelty. Truly sounds like a very niche stand-up comedy routine gone terribly, terribly wrong. His disregard for tradition extended to his appointments. He gave important government positions to cronies, unqualified dancers, barbers, and even a charioteer, all based on personal favor rather than merit. The Senate, once the backbone of Roman governance, was completely sidelined and openly ridiculed. He established a Senate of women, headed by his mother and grandmother, where trivial matters like dress codes and the seating arrangement at public events were debated. While a Senate of women sounds progressive by modern standards, in the context of conservative Rome and Elagabalus's overall mockery of institutions, it was seen as another calculated insult to traditional power structures. The Roman military, always a crucial factor in imperial stability, grew increasingly restless. Elagabalus spent enormous sums on lavish gifts for his favorites and his cult, but neglected the legions, failing to pay them adequately or consistently. This was a critical misstep, as the Praetorian Guard and the army were the true power brokers in Rome. You could mess with the Senate, mock the gods, and wear all the makeup you wanted, but you did not mess with the soldiers. It's like forgetting to feed the very large, very well-armed guard dog you've installed to protect your gold-leafed mansion. Eventually, that dog is going to turn on you. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had engineered his rise to power, quickly realized that her grandson was an unmitigated disaster, jeopardizing the entire family's standing. She quietly began to groom her other grandson, Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander, as a more respectable alternative. She convinced Elagabalus to adopt Alexander and name him co-emperor, ostensibly to share the burdens of power, but in reality, to establish a viable successor. Elagabalus, perhaps momentarily swayed or genuinely believing it would bring stability, agreed. However, he soon grew jealous of Alexander's popularity and tried to strip him of his titles and even have him assassinated. This was the final straw. The Praetorian Guard, loyal to Julia Maesa and sensing an opportunity for a more stable regime, mutinied. On March 11, 222 AD, Elagabalus, still only 18 years old, was dragged from the imperial palace along with his mother, Julia Soaemias. They were both murdered, their bodies desecrated and dragged through the streets of Rome before being thrown into the Tiber River. His name was condemned, and all images of him were destroyed. It was a chaotic, ignominious end to a short but incredibly impactful reign, a whirlwind of religious fervor, gender fluidity, and utter, self-destructive extravagance. Historians still debate whether Elagabalus was truly mad or a deeply misunderstood figure attempting to radically reform Roman society and religion. Leaving the swirling sands and strange gods of ancient Rome, we now leap forward centuries and across continents, to the often muddy, perpetually squabbling kingdoms of medieval Europe. You find yourself standing, somewhat uncomfortably, in the drafty, smoke-filled great halls of 13th-century England, amidst the clang of armor and the constant grumbling of barons. Our next subject is a king whose name has become synonymous with villainy: John, King of England. Born on Christmas Eve, 1166, John was the youngest of Henry II's 5 sons and, as such, was never expected to inherit the throne. He was nicknamed Lackland because, unlike his elder brothers who were granted vast territories, John was initially given no substantial lands. This early insecurity, some historians speculate, contributed to his avaricious and paranoid personality. Imagine growing up in a family where all your older siblings get cool toys, and you get, well, nothing. It's enough to make anyone a bit resentful, maybe even a little petty. John's early career was marked by treachery. He famously plotted against his brother, Richard I, while Richard was off on the Third Crusade, even attempting to usurp the throne. Richard, known as the Lionheart, was captured on his way home and held for ransom. While his loyal subjects were scraping together the colossal sum for his release, John was actively working with Richard's captors, offering them money to keep him imprisoned. It's a classic move from the How to Be a Really Bad Brother playbook. Richard, upon his return, surprisingly forgave John, but the stain of his disloyalty was already set. When Richard died in 1199, John, through a combination of swift action and questionable legal maneuvering, managed to seize the throne over the claims of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. This was a pivotal moment, as Arthur had a strong claim, and many nobles in France supported him. John's handling of Arthur sealed his reputation for ruthlessness. Arthur was captured, imprisoned, and then, mysteriously, disappeared. The prevailing belief, never proven but widely suspected, was that John himself murdered his nephew. You can almost hear the hushed whispers in the castles, the sideways glances, the chilling realization that this king would stop at nothing to secure his power. Historians still argue about the precise circumstances of Arthur's death, but most agree it was John's doing, or at least at his command. John's personality was a volatile cocktail of suspicion, cruelty, and unbridled greed. He saw the law as a tool for his personal enrichment, extorting money from his subjects through exorbitant taxes, fines, and arbitrary seizures of property. He would frequently demand huge sums of money from widows for the right to remarry, or from heiresses for the right to marry at all, essentially holding their lives hostage for cash. It was a highly effective, if deeply unpopular, way to fill his coffers. It's like running a protection racket, but with a crown and a divine right to rule. He also had a nasty habit of imprisoning and starving to death the families of nobles who defied him, a truly barbaric practice. You can almost feel the chill wind whipping through the great hall, carrying with it the complaints of a kingdom burdened by King John's insatiable avarice. His personal life was as chaotic and self-serving as his public reign. He was notorious for his promiscuity, reportedly having numerous mistresses and fathering many illegitimate children. More disturbingly, he was known to make inappropriate advances on the wives and daughters of his own barons. Imagine being a powerful lord, sworn to fealty, only to discover your king has designs on your family. This wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a profound insult, a personal violation that fueled the growing resentment among his already taxed and abused nobility. It was the medieval equivalent of your boss not only stealing your lunch, but also hitting on your spouse at the company picnic. Just truly, truly rude. His military failures further eroded his standing. John lost most of England's continental possessions, including Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, to King Philip II of France. These territories had been the ancestral lands of the Plantagenet dynasty for centuries, and their loss was a massive blow to English prestige and John's personal authority. He earned another unflattering nickname, Soft Sword, for his perceived military incompetence. While he launched several campaigns to reclaim his lost lands, they were invariably ill-conceived, poorly executed, and ultimately disastrous. It was like watching someone repeatedly try to hit a nail with a marshmallow, enthusiastic, perhaps, but utterly ineffective. John's greatest conflict, however, was with the Church. He famously quarreled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. John refused to accept Langton, leading the Pope to place England under an interdict, effectively banning all church services, baptisms, marriages, and burials in the country. Imagine a whole nation suddenly deprived of spiritual comfort, the fear of eternal damnation hanging heavy in the air. John responded by seizing church property and persecuting clergy who remained loyal to the Pope. This standoff lasted for years, finally ending with John's humiliating submission, where he formally acknowledged England and Ireland as papal fiefs, essentially making himself a vassal of the Pope. It was a complete capitulation, and it made him look incredibly weak in the eyes of his own people. Historians still argue whether John's stubbornness was born of genuine conviction or merely a characteristic refusal to back down, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The combined weight of his greed, cruelty, military incompetence, and humiliation by the Pope finally led to an open rebellion of his barons. They had had enough. In 1215, they confronted John at Runnymede and forced him to seal the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. This document, while initially a pragmatic peace treaty designed to limit the king's power and protect baronial rights, has become a foundational document for constitutional law worldwide, establishing the principle that even the king is subject to the law. John, however, had no intention of abiding by it. He immediately appealed to the Pope, who conveniently annulled the charter, leading to the First Barons' War. John's reign ended not on the battlefield, but somewhat ingloriously from dysentery, possibly exacerbated by eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider. He died on October 19, 1216, amidst the ongoing civil war. His son, Henry III, succeeded him, inheriting a kingdom in chaos. John's legacy, largely shaped by contemporary chroniclers who despised him, has remained one of the most reviled monarchs in English history, a king whose personal vices and incompetence brought his realm to the brink of ruin. You can almost hear the sigh of relief across the land, even as the war continued. From the damp, often disagreeable climate of medieval England, you now find yourself transported to the vast, enigmatic plains and icy forests of 16th-century Russia. The air here feels heavier, perhaps with the weight of ancient superstitions and the looming threat of boyar intrigues. We are here to witness the reign of a Tsar whose name strikes fear and fascination in equal measure, Ivan IV Vasilyevich, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530, Ivan's childhood was a brutal crucible. His father, Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, then ruled as regent but died when he was 8, possibly poisoned. What followed was a truly horrific period of boyar, noble rule, characterized by intense power struggles, corruption, and neglect of the young Tsar. Ivan and his younger brother, Yuri, were often left hungry, poorly clothed, and treated with contempt by the warring noble factions. Imagine being a child, a king no less, but feeling utterly powerless, constantly surrounded by adults who were more interested in carving up the kingdom than caring for its future ruler. It's the kind of childhood that can really mess a person up, turning a budding personality into something quite twisted. This traumatic upbringing instilled in Ivan a deep-seated paranoia, a profound distrust of the boyars, and an understanding that power, once gained, had to be held onto with absolute ruthlessness. He witnessed public acts of violence and humiliation inflicted upon those who fell out of favor, and learned early that fear was a powerful tool. One mainstream historical fact: Ivan was officially crowned Tsar of all Rus in 1547, the first Russian ruler to adopt this title, signaling a shift in Moscow's imperial ambitions. His early reign, surprisingly, was marked by significant reforms and military successes. He created a standing army, reformed the legal code, established the Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly, and expanded the empire significantly, conquering the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. He was a visionary, intelligent, and deeply pious ruler who modernized many aspects of Russian governance. For a time, it seemed Russia had found a capable, if stern, leader. However, the paranoia instilled in him by his youth never truly left. It festered, slowly consuming him, fueled by illnesses, personal losses, and perceived betrayals. The death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, was a critical turning point. Ivan believed she had been poisoned by the boyars, and his grief quickly curdled into an intense, all-encompassing suspicion. This triggered what historians refer to as his reign of terror. He became convinced that the boyars were conspiring against him, seeking to usurp his power and destroy his family. As you stand in the frigid air of Ivan's Russia, you can almost hear the creak of the gallows and the muffled cries of the condemned. The reign of terror initiated by Ivan was an unprecedented wave of state-sponsored violence. He created the Oprichnina, a separate territory within Russia directly controlled by him, complete with its own army, the Oprichniki. These black-clad enforcers, riding black horses and carrying dog heads on their saddles, or sometimes broomsticks, signifying their role as sweepers of treason, were given free rein to terrorize the boyars and anyone suspected of disloyalty. Imagine a secret police force dressed like Halloween costumes, but instead of candy, they deliver unspeakable torment. It's a horrifying image, and their brutality was legendary. The Oprichnina era was marked by mass executions, torture, and the confiscation of land. Entire towns were ravaged, their inhabitants massacred. The wealthy city of Novgorod, suspected of disloyalty, suffered a particularly brutal purge in 1570, where thousands were reportedly tortured and murdered. Ivan himself would sometimes participate in the tortures, displaying a chilling enjoyment in the suffering of his victims. He'd even concoct bizarre, grotesque trials for his perceived enemies, followed by public executions that were designed to instill maximum terror. It's like a macabre reality show, where the ratings are measured in screams. Ivan's cruelty wasn't reserved for his enemies. It extended to his own family and closest associates. He notoriously murdered his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581. The story goes that he struck his son in the head with his royal staff during a heated argument, possibly over the treatment of his son's pregnant wife. The blow proved fatal. Imagine the chilling silence in the palace after that, the realization that even the Tsar's own flesh and blood weren't safe from his fits of rage. This act, deeply regretted by Ivan later, devastated him and left Russia without a clear, strong heir, setting the stage for a future time of troubles. Historians still argue about the exact circumstances and Ivan's state of mind during this tragic event, but its impact on Russian history is undeniable. Despite his extreme cruelty, Ivan was also deeply religious, if in a convoluted and often contradictory way. He would alternate between fits of rage and periods of intense prayer and repentance. He ordered lists of his victims to be compiled and sent to monasteries, requesting prayers for their souls. It's a quirky tidbit that reveals the complex, tormented psychology of the man, a killer seeking divine forgiveness for his atrocities, a mix of piety and profound sin. He even considered abdicating and becoming a monk at one point, a stark contrast to his tyrannical rule. Ivan's foreign policy, particularly his lengthy and ultimately unsuccessful Livonian War, further drained the country's resources and contributed to a period of economic decline. He sought access to the Baltic Sea, but his costly military campaigns against Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden were largely failures, exposing Russia's vulnerabilities. He exhausted his treasury and his people's patience, leaving a legacy not just of terror, but of an impoverished and unstable state. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess. His reign, spanning over 50 years, was pivotal in shaping the Russian state, expanding its territory, and solidifying the power of the autocratic Tsardom. But it came at an immense human cost, leaving behind a legacy of fear, suspicion, and a deeply scarred nation. His nickname, Grozny in Russian, means formidable or awe-inspiring as much as terrible, reflecting the complex mixture of fear and respect he commanded. Leaving the frosty grip of the Russian Tsardom, you now find yourself in the bustling, often boisterous court of 16th-century England, a land of vibrant personalities and dramatic shift. The air crackles with political intrigue, religious upheaval, and the unmistakable scent of royal ambition. Our next subject is a monarch whose relentless pursuit of a male heir reshaped an entire nation and cost a few wives their heads. Henry VIII. Born in 1491, Henry was initially destined for a career in the church, with his older brother Arthur being the heir apparent. However, Arthur's premature death in 1502 unexpectedly thrust Henry into the role of future king. Imagine being groomed for a life of quiet scholarship and piety, only to suddenly be told, surprise, you're going to be king and you need to get married, probably to your dead brother's wife. It's quite the career change. When he ascended the throne in 1509, at the age of 17, Henry was a charismatic, athletic, and intelligent young man, admired by all. He was a true Renaissance prince, a talented musician, a skilled juster, and well-versed in theology. His reign started auspiciously, but it would ultimately be defined by his marital woes and the seismic shift they brought to England. Henry's desperate desire for a legitimate male heir consumed him. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, with whom he had a daughter, Mary. After years of marriage, with no living male heir and Catherine past childbearing age, Henry became convinced that his marriage was cursed, citing a passage in Leviticus that prohibited marrying a brother's wife. He desperately needed an annulment, but the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused. This refusal sparked one of the most significant events in English history, the English Reformation. Henry, impatient and resolute, decided to break away from the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and grant himself the annulment. This was a radical move, transforming England's religious, political, and social landscape forever. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a revolution, tearing centuries of tradition apart for the sake of one man's dynastic ambition. You can almost hear the collective gasp across Catholic Europe, the horrified whispers about heresy and defiance. Having divorced Catherine, Henry then married Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting at court, whom he had pursued relentlessly, and gave birth to another daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was bitterly disappointed. His initial passion for Anne quickly waned, replaced by suspicion and paranoia. Within 3 years, Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges widely believed to be fabricated. She was tried, found guilty, and executed at the Tower of London in 1536. Imagine marrying the king, rising to unimaginable heights, only to be accused of the most heinous crimes and executed within a few short years. It's a stark reminder that even a queen's head could be very, very loose. His marital merry-go-round continued. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave him the son he craved, Edward, but she tragically died shortly after childbirth. Henry genuinely mourned Jane. She was, arguably, his most beloved wife. His fourth marriage, to Anne of Cleves, was a political match arranged after seeing a flattering portrait. Henry found her physically unappealing in person, supposedly calling her the Flanders mare, and quickly divorced her. It's perhaps the world's most expensive and consequential blind date. You can almost see the heads rolling, metaphorically speaking, as Henry VIII continued his relentless pursuit of a legitimate male heir. After the fleeting Anne of Cleves, he married the young and vivacious Catherine Howard. This marriage, however, was also short-lived and ended tragically. Catherine was indeed found to have engaged in premarital sexual relationships and, more damningly, possibly flirted with others while married to the king. Accusations of adultery and treason quickly followed. Henry, by now a portly, ailing monarch, was reportedly devastated by this perceived betrayal. Catherine was executed in 1542, following in Anne Boleyn's footsteps. It's a sobering thought, to be queen one day and facing the executioner the next, all for the whims and insecurities of a powerful man. His sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, a wealthy widow who provided him with companionship and acted as a kind of nursemaid in his final, painful years. She outlived him, a testament to her quiet strength and careful navigation of the treacherous royal court. Henry's obsessive quest for a male heir consumed much of his reign, leading to a succession of marriages that were often brutal in their conclusion. He left behind a legacy of 6 wives, 3 of whom were divorced, 2 executed, and 1 who finally survived him. It's a marital track record that would make even a modern-day reality TV star blush. Beyond his marriages, Henry's reign was characterized by the dissolution of the monasteries, a move that consolidated royal power and wealth by seizing vast church lands and treasures. This was less about religious purity and more about filling the royal coffers and rewarding loyal supporters. He also oversaw the Act of Union with Wales, integrating it fully into the English legal and administrative system. But his defining legacy remains the English Reformation, which, while driven by personal desire, irrevocably altered the course of English history, establishing the Anglican Church and laying the groundwork for future religious conflicts. Henry died in 1547, a bloated, diseased, and increasingly tyrannical figure, leaving his young son Edward VI to inherit a kingdom profoundly changed by his father's immense, often terrifying, will. Historians still argue whether Henry was a brilliant statesman or a self-serving tyrant who inadvertently sparked a religious revolution. Leaving the complex world of English Tudors, you are now whisked away to the rugged, forested landscapes of 15th-century Wallachia, a land shrouded in mist and grim legends. The air here seems to hum with ancient fears, and the scent of pine is occasionally overlaid with something metallic and unsettling. We are about to encounter a ruler whose name became synonymous with unimaginable cruelty, inspiring one of literature's most enduring monsters, Vlad III Dracula, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Born around 1431, Vlad's early life was a turbulent affair. Wallachia, a principality sandwiched between the powerful Ottoman Empire and Hungary, was constantly under threat. Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracul, meaning the dragon or the devil, as he was a member of the Order of the Dragon, sent young Vlad and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the Ottoman court to ensure his loyalty. Imagine being a child, ripped from your family, living in a foreign court where your life is a pawn in a brutal game of geopolitics. This period, spent under the watchful, often threatening eyes of the Ottomans, undoubtedly shaped Vlad's character, hardening him and perhaps imbuing him with a deep-seated hatred for his captors, as well as an understanding of ruthless power. When he finally returned to Wallachia, Vlad ascended to the throne in 1448, but his reign was incredibly unstable, marked by repeated depositions and bloody struggles for power. His first short reign lasted only 2 months. His true terror began with his second, longer reign in 1456. Vlad's primary goal was to strengthen central authority, suppress the boyars who constantly plotted against him, and resist Ottoman expansion. He ruled with an iron fist, convinced that only extreme measures could bring order to his chaotic land. His chosen method of punishment was so horrific that it earned him his enduring nickname, impalement. This involved driving a long wooden stake through a person's body, usually entering through the rectum and emerging through the mouth or shoulder, without piercing vital organs, ensuring a slow and agonizing death. Victims would sometimes linger for days, twisting in agony on the stakes. Imagine rows upon rows of impaled bodies, a grotesque forest of human suffering, lining the roads leading to his capital. This gruesome sight was a deliberate tactic, designed to terrify his enemies and instill absolute obedience in his subjects. It was an early form of psychological warfare, and it was incredibly effective. Vlad was particularly brutal with the boyars who had either betrayed his family or challenged his authority. A famous story, though possibly exaggerated, tells of him inviting all the prominent boyars to a feast. When asked how many princes they had ruled under, and upon receiving their answers, Vlad supposedly had all the older boyars impaled, and forced the younger ones to march miles to rebuild a dilapidated fortress, working until their clothes rotted off their bodies. This act, whether literal or symbolic, underscores his relentless campaign to consolidate power and eliminate potential rivals. It was a clear message: mess with Vlad and you'll get the point. His most famous act of impalement occurred during a war against the Ottoman Empire. In 1462, as the massive Ottoman army led by Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, advanced into Wallachia, they were met not with resistance, but with a chilling spectacle: the Forest of the Impaled. Outside the city of Targovist, Vlad had impaled an estimated 20,000 captured Turks and traitorous Wallachians. The sight was so horrifying, the stench of death so overwhelming, that it reportedly demoralized the Ottoman army and convinced Sultan Mehmed to retreat. It was a gruesome victory, born of psychological terror rather than direct military confrontation. Historians still argue about the exact number of victims, but the impact of this event is undeniable. As you stand, transfixed, by the ghostly echoes of Vlad the Impaler's reign, the air still feels heavy with the weight of unspeakable acts. His cruelty extended beyond impalement. He reportedly had people skinned alive, boiled, or roasted. He would nail turbans to the heads of Ottoman envoys who refused to remove them in his presence, considering it an act of defiance. He even had beggars and vagrants invited to a grand feast, only to lock the doors and set the building on fire, claiming he was ridding Wallachia of its unproductive members. It's a dark, twisted vision of social cleansing, a macabre efficiency that truly defines the terrible in his name. This isn't just cruelty. It's a cold, calculating application of terror to achieve political ends. You wouldn't want to be on his guest list, that's for sure. Despite his horrific methods, Vlad is also remembered by some in Romania as a national hero who fiercely resisted the Ottoman Empire and maintained Wallachian independence. He brought a brutal but effective order to a chaotic land, suppressing internal corruption and maintaining a strong defense against external threats. This dual legacy, of both monster and patriot, makes him one of history's most fascinating and unsettling figures. He was a product of his brutal times, where survival often demanded extreme measures, but he took those measures to an entirely different, chilling level. Vlad's end, like much of his life, is shrouded in mystery. He was killed in battle against the Ottomans in late 1476 or early 1477, but the exact circumstances are unclear. Some accounts say he was ambushed and killed by Ottoman forces, while others suggest he might have been killed by treacherous Wallachian boyars. His head was reportedly sent to Constantinople to prove his death to the Sultan. Thus ended the life of a ruler whose legacy continues to inspire both horror and a strange, reluctant admiration for his unwavering resolve. The legends of his cruelty, amplified over centuries, became the foundation for Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, forever intertwining history with the supernatural. Leaving the chilling shadow of the Carpathians, you are transported to the sun-drenched, yet politically turbulent landscape of early 19th century Spain. The echoes of the Napoleonic Wars still resonate, and the scent of revolution and restoration hangs heavy in the air. Our next royal subject is Ferdinand VII of Spain, a king whose return to power was a brutal reversal of progress and a testament to the enduring allure of absolute monarchy. Born in 1784, Ferdinand was the son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma. His parents were largely ineffective rulers, and Ferdinand grew up in a court rife with intrigue and dominated by his mother's favorite, Manuel Godoy. As crown prince, Ferdinand actively plotted against his father and Godoy, aligning himself with those who sought to reform the Spanish monarchy. Imagine the dysfunctional family dinners, where the son is actively trying to undermine his parents' authority, and everyone knows it. It's like a really dramatic, high-stakes telenovela, but with real crowns and consequences. The chaos of the Napoleonic Wars provided Ferdinand with his opportunity. In 1808, Napoleon forced both Charles IV and Ferdinand to abdicate, installing his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. Ferdinand was exiled to France, where he was held captive at Valencia. While in exile, he shrewdly portrayed himself as a victim of Napoleon and a symbol of Spanish resistance. The Spanish people, fighting a brutal guerrilla war against the French occupation, largely viewed Ferdinand as their legitimate king, the embodiment of Spanish nationalism and tradition. He was the desired one, the man who would restore Spain to its former glory. However, the war against Napoleon also spurred a liberal movement in Spain. In 1812, a Cortes parliament, assembled in Cádiz, drafted a liberal constitution, establishing a constitutional monarchy and limiting the power of the king. This constitution was a beacon of hope for reformers, envisioning a modern, enlightened Spain. When Ferdinand was finally allowed to return to Spain in 1814, after Napoleon's defeat, the stage was set for a clash between the desired one and the aspirations of a new, liberal Spain. Upon his return, Ferdinand VII wasted no time in revealing his true, deeply autocratic colors. Despite swearing allegiance to the 1812 Constitution, he almost immediately repudiated it. With the support of conservative elements of the nobility and the church, and crucially, the army, he dissolved the Cortes, abolished the Constitution, and reinstated absolute monarchy. All the progress made during the liberal interregnum was brutally reversed. It was like finally getting a really good, sensible user manual for your complex, broken device, only for the original, deeply flawed designer to show up and burn it. You can almost hear the collective sigh of despair from the liberals and reformers. Ferdinand then launched a period of intense repression. Liberals, journalists, military officers, and anyone suspected of supporting the Constitution were persecuted, imprisoned, or exiled. Many were executed. The Inquisition, abolished during the Napoleonic era, was reinstated, albeit with limited powers, becoming a tool for political control and ideological conformity. Universities were closed, books were censored, and intellectual freedom was stifled. He even brought back torture as a legal practice for interrogations, a chilling regression to medieval practices. It was a clear message: conformity or punishment. This was not a king who believed in compromise. He believed in total obedience. Historians still argue about the extent of Ferdinand's personal vindictiveness versus his strategic need to reassert control in a deeply fractured nation. His reign was marked by a constant struggle against a persistent liberal underground and a series of military uprisings. In 1820, a military revolt led by Rafael del Riego forced Ferdinand, briefly, to restore the liberal constitution. This liberal triennium lasted for 3 years, a brief flowering of reform before Ferdinand, with the help of a French invasion force sanctioned by the Holy Alliance, conservative European powers, once again crushed the liberals and reinstated absolute rule. The subsequent decade, known as the ominous decade, 1823 to 1833, was characterized by even more severe repression, with thousands of liberals imprisoned or executed. As you linger in the shadow of Ferdinand VII's oppressive reign, you can almost taste the bitter tang of thwarted hopes and silenced dissent in the Spanish air. His rule was not just politically repressive, it was financially ruinous. He mismanaged the economy, further alienating the powerful and wealthy elite. More significantly, his inability to address the grievances of Spain's vast American colonies led directly to their wars of independence. While he was busy crushing liberalism at home, Spain was losing an entire empire overseas. It was like carefully rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while the ship was already sinking, but also actively punching holes in the hull yourself. You wouldn't want to be his financial advisor or, well, a liberal in Spain at all. Ferdinand's personal life was as traditional and politically driven as his public one. He married 4 times, all dynastic matches, but produced no surviving male heir until his 4th wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. This created a new succession crisis, as Spanish law traditionally favored male heirs. Just before his death in 1833, Ferdinand, desperate to ensure his daughter's succession, issued the Pragmatic Sanction, which allowed females to inherit the throne. This move alienated his brother, Don Carlos, who believed he was the rightful heir, setting the stage for the devastating Carlist Wars that would plague Spain for decades after Ferdinand's death. He died having secured his daughter's claim but plunging his nation into further dynastic conflict. Ferdinand VII remains a deeply divisive figure in Spanish history, seen by some as the restorer of order and tradition, and by others as a tyrannical despot who stifled progress and left a legacy of bitter division. His reign stands as a stark reminder of how a monarch, seemingly welcomed back as a national hero, can quickly devolve into a force of brutal repression, determined to turn back the clock at any cost. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand was a cynical opportunist or a sincerely deluded believer in absolute monarchy. Leaving the echoes of Spain's tumultuous 19th century, you are now transported to the steamy, dense jungles and rubber plantations of Central Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The air is thick with the scent of tropical vegetation, but beneath it, a chilling odor of exploitation and suffering pervades. We are about to witness one of history's most horrific acts of colonial brutality, orchestrated not by a vast empire, but by a single, avaricious king, Leopold II of Belgium. Born in 1835, Leopold was a quiet, ambitious prince who grew up with an insatiable desire for a colony. Belgium was a small, relatively new nation, and Leopold, unlike other European monarchs who inherited empires, felt a deep sense of inadequacy and a burning ambition to make his mark on the world stage. He saw colonies as a source of national prestige and personal wealth. Imagine someone with a serious case of FOMO, but instead of missing out on a party, they're missing out on owning vast tracts of foreign land and the people on it. It's a very particular kind of ambition. While other European powers were scrambling for territory in Africa during the scramble for Africa, Leopold shrewdly presented himself not as a colonizer, but as a philanthropist. He established the International African Association in 1876, claiming its purpose was to suppress the slave trade, promote civilization, and conduct scientific exploration in the Congo Basin. This was a brilliant, cynical deception, playing on the humanitarian sentiments of the time. He hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to map the region and sign treaties with local chiefs, effectively gaining control over a vast territory of Central Africa. These treaties were often signed by chiefs who had no concept of European land ownership, trading away their ancestral lands for trinkets. Through these seemingly innocuous ventures, Leopold managed to gain personal control over an enormous territory, 76 times the size of Belgium itself, which he named the Congo Free State. This was not a Belgian colony. It was Leopold's personal property, his private domain, answerable only to him. Imagine owning a country all to yourself, with no oversight. It's the ultimate monopoly game, but with real people and real resources. The true nature of Leopold's philanthropy quickly became horrifyingly clear. The Congo Free State was transformed into a forced labor camp, primarily for the extraction of rubber and ivory. Demand for rubber soared with the advent of bicycles and automobiles, and Leopold was determined to profit. He implemented a brutal system where local Congolese were forced to meet impossible quotas of rubber collection. If they failed, their villages were burned, their crops destroyed, and their families held hostage. The most infamous punishment for failing to meet quotas was the severing of hands, often of children, as proof of punishment from the European supervisors. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of the machete and the screams echoing through the jungle. The atrocities committed in the Congo Free State were almost beyond belief. Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, composed of African soldiers led by European officers, enforced these quotas with extreme violence. Beatings, torture, mutilation, and mass killings were routine. Women were often raped and held hostage in hostage houses, until their husbands or fathers delivered their rubber quotas. The population of the Congo Free State plummeted from an estimated 20 million in 1885 to around 10 million by 1910, though precise figures are difficult to ascertain. This loss of life was due to outright murder, starvation, disease, and reduced birth rates caused by the constant terror and displacement. Historians still argue about the exact death toll, but there is no doubt it was a genocide on an unimaginable scale. Leopold, meanwhile, amassed an immense personal fortune from the Congo's resources. He built grand palaces, triumphal arches, and public works in Belgium, funded by the blood money from his African enterprise. He maintained a meticulous public image as a benevolent monarch, carefully cultivating international opinion and dismissing reports of atrocities as exaggerations or fabrications. It was an astonishing act of duplicity, a global con game built on unimaginable human suffering. It's like a supervillain funding his lair by selling organs on the black market, but with official titles and fancy uniforms. As you continue to bear witness to the horrors of Leopold II's personal empire, you can almost feel the humid air heavy with the cries of the suffering, a stark contrast to the opulence being built back in Belgium. The extent of the atrocities in the Congo Free State eventually became too vast to conceal. Missionaries, former employees, and courageous journalists, like Edmund Dean Morel and Roger Casement, began to expose the truth to the world. Their reports, filled with eyewitness accounts and photographic evidence of mutilations, sparked an international outcry. This was arguably the first major international human rights campaign, a testament to the power of public opinion when confronted with undeniable evil. Leopold fiercely resisted these exposures, employing an extensive propaganda machine and an army of public relations agents to discredit the reports and maintain his benevolent image. He funded denials, bought off newspapers, and even used his diplomatic connections to silence critics. It was a sophisticated operation, worthy of a modern spin doctor, all in service of maintaining a lie of monstrous proportions. But the weight of evidence, particularly Casement's detailed report of 1904, became undeniable. The international pressure, combined with growing dissent within Belgium, finally forced Leopold to relinquish his personal control over the Congo. In 1908, just a year before his death, he reluctantly ceded the Congo Free State to the Belgian government, transforming it into a Belgian colony. While this transfer brought some administrative reforms and a theoretical end to the most egregious abuses, the legacy of exploitation and underdevelopment continued for decades. Leopold died in 1909, a fabulously wealthy man, having successfully evaded any direct punishment for the atrocities committed under his personal rule. His funeral procession was reportedly booed by his own subjects, a rare public display of disapproval for a monarch, perhaps a tiny vindication for the millions who suffered. Historians still argue whether the Belgian government, in taking over, truly reformed the system or merely sanitized it for public consumption. From the dark heart of colonial Africa, you now drift across the North Sea to the cold, often melancholic, courts of 18th-century Denmark-Norway. The air here carries the faint scent of stale parchment and simmering frustration, a kingdom struggling with the peculiar tragedy of a king lost to his own mind. Our focus now is Christian VII, a monarch whose mental illness allowed others to wield power, often with disastrous consequences for his realm and his personal life. Born in 1749, Christian was the son of Frederick V of Denmark-Norway. His childhood was marked by a deeply troubled relationship with his father, who was reportedly a heavy drinker, and a strict, unloving upbringing. From an early age, it became apparent that Christian was not mentally stable. He exhibited erratic behavior, severe anxieties, and hallucinations. Imagine being a prince, groomed for kingship, but feeling your own mind slip away, a terrifying internal prison. It's a profound tragedy, not just for the individual, but for an entire nation dependent on his sanity. When Christian ascended to the throne in 1766 at the age of 17, his mental state quickly deteriorated. He was prone to violent outbursts, periods of deep melancholy, and fits of what appeared to be schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. He became increasingly isolated, preferring the company of a prostitute named Anna Catherine Bent Hagen to the strictures of court life, and engaging in erratic behavior that shocked his conservative court. He suffered from delusions, believing he was being persecuted, and experienced periods of catatonia interspersed with frenetic activity. He was, in essence, a king in name only, a puppet whose strings were pulled by those around him. This power vacuum created an environment ripe for manipulation. The initial years of his reign saw various factions at court vying for control, including his stepmother, Queen Dowager Juliana Maria, and his half-brother, Prince Frederick. However, the most significant figure to emerge was Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor who became Christian's personal physician in 1768. Struensee, a charismatic and intelligent man with Enlightenment ideas, quickly gained the king's trust, becoming his closest confidant and eventually, his de facto ruler. Struensee achieved this remarkable ascent by exploiting Christian's mental illness. He managed to calm the king's fits and provide him with a sense of stability, albeit a dependent one. He encouraged Christian's eccentricities while simultaneously taking over all aspects of government. Imagine a doctor becoming your best friend, then your only friend, and then slowly, subtly taking over your entire life, including your job as king. It's a slow-motion coup, disguised as therapy. He famously acquired an unlimited power of attorney from the king, essentially allowing him to issue royal decrees without consulting anyone. Once in power, Struensee initiated a rapid and sweeping program of reforms, often issuing decrees at a breathtaking pace, sometimes as many as 9 a day. He abolished censorship, reformed the judiciary, introduced religious tolerance, improved conditions for serfs, and reorganized the administration along rational lines. Many of his reforms were genuinely progressive, reflecting the ideals of the Enlightenment. However, his methods were highly autocratic. He bypassed the Privy Council and ruled entirely through the king's personal authority, alienating the nobility, the church, and the bureaucracy. He also dismissed many officials and replaced them with his own appointees, often Germans. To add another layer of scandal, Struensee embarked on a passionate affair with Christian's young queen, Caroline Mathilde, the sister of King George III of Great Britain. They had a child together, Princess Louise Augusta, who was widely believed to be Struensee's daughter. This affair, conducted openly within the royal court, was a profound insult to the monarchy and a source of immense public outrage, especially among the conservative elite who already resented Struensee's reforms and his foreign origins. It was an explosive combination: an illegitimate ruler, progressive reforms, and a scandalous royal affair. You can almost feel the tension building in the palace, a pressure cooker of ambition, resentment, and illicit passion. Historians still argue about the true nature of the Queen's involvement and the extent to which she was a willing participant or a victim of circumstances. As you continue to observe the dramatic intertwining of madness, reform, and scandal in the Danish court, the atmosphere feels charged with an inevitable reckoning. Struensee's rapid accumulation of power and his blatant affair with the Queen created a powerful coalition of enemies. The Queen Dowager Juliana Maria and her son, Prince Frederick, saw their opportunity to regain influence. They skillfully exploited the resentment of the nobility, the fear of the church, and the widespread outrage over the royal scandal. It's like watching a meticulously planned political assassination, but with less blood and more whispered plots in candlelit rooms. On the night of January 16 to 17, 1772, a coup d'état was launched. With the mentally incapacitated King Christian VII coerced into signing the arrest warrants, Struensee and his closest accomplice, Ennevold Brant, who had helped him control the king, were arrested. Queen Caroline Mathilde was also arrested and imprisoned. The reaction from the public was one of celebration. Struensee was despised for his arrogance and his perceived usurpation of power. Struensee was put on trial for usurpation of royal authority and for his affair with the queen. He was found guilty and, on April 28, 1772, was brutally executed. His right hand was cut off, then his head and his body was quartered. Brant suffered a similar fate. Queen Caroline Mathilde's life was spared due to the intervention of her brother, King George III of Great Britain. She was divorced from Christian VII and exiled to Celle, Germany, where she died 3 years later at the age of 23. Her story is a poignant one, of a young woman caught in a political and personal maelstrom. After Struensee's fall, the Queen Dowager Juliana Maria and Prince Frederick effectively ruled Denmark-Norway, though they largely reversed Struensee's more radical reforms, restoring a more conservative order. King Christian VII lived for another 34 years, but his mental state never recovered. He remained king in name only, a sad, withdrawn figure who spent his days largely in isolation, a living symbol of a kingdom ruled by proxy. He died in 1808. His tragic reign is a unique case study in the dangers of absolute power in the hands of the mentally ill and the ruthless ambition of those around them. Historians still argue about whether Struensee was a true visionary tragically ahead of his time or a self-serving opportunist. Leaving the chilly, formal courts of Scandinavia, you are plunged into the vibrant, often chaotic and surprisingly brutal world of 18th-century Imperial Russia. The scent of vodka, gunpowder, and boundless ambition hangs heavy in the air. We are here to meet a giant of Russian history, a reformer and a tyrant in equal measure, whose larger-than-life personality was matched only by his gargantuan excesses, Peter I. Alexeyevich, famously known as Peter the Great. Born in 1672, Peter's early life was marked by political instability and family intrigue. He shared the throne initially with his sickly half-brother Ivan V, under the regency of their half-sister, the ambitious Sophia Alexeyevna. Imagine a kingdom with 2 child kings and a power-hungry princess pulling the strings behind the scenes. It's a recipe for simmering resentment, and Peter, growing up in this environment, learned quickly about the brutal realities of power. Peter was not a typical Russian czar. He was immensely curious, restless, and possessed a boundless energy. He was fascinated by Western technology, particularly shipbuilding and military tactics, seeing them as essential for modernizing Russia and making it a major European power. As a young man, he would often sneak away from the palace to work in the shipyards, learning practical skills alongside common laborers. He was almost a foot taller than most men of his time, a physical giant with a matching ambition. His famous Grand Embassy to Western Europe in 1697 to 1698 was unprecedented for a Russian czar. He traveled incognito, though his immense height and retinue made this difficult, like trying to hide an elephant in a teacup factory. Working as a shipwright in the Netherlands and England, studying everything from naval architecture to anatomy. This hands-on approach to learning was revolutionary for a monarch. He wasn't just observing, he was doing. This trip profoundly influenced his vision for Russia, convincing him of the urgent need for radical reforms to drag his country out of medieval isolation. Upon his return, Peter unleashed a torrent of reforms, often enforced with brute force. He introduced Western dress and customs, famously ordering his nobles to shave off their traditional long beards or pay a beard tax. Imagine being a proud, bearded Russian noble, suddenly faced with the choice of losing your facial hair or handing over your hard-earned rubles. It was a visual symbol of his determination to modernize Russia, whether his subjects liked it or not. He reformed the army and navy, established a secular education system, reformed the calendar, and even simplified the Russian alphabet. He built factories, canals, and roads, transforming Russia's economy. This was a mainstream historical fact that utterly changed the face of Russia. However, Peter's modernization came at a staggering human cost and was often accompanied by immense cruelty and personal depravity. He was known for his monstrous rages and his willingness to use torture and execution to enforce his will. He notoriously participated in the torture and execution of the Streltsy, the old Muscovite palace guard, who had rebelled against him. He reportedly left their bodies hanging outside his sister Sophia's window as a grim warning. Peter's personal life was as unrestrained as his reforms. He loved drinking, carousing, and wild parties, often forcing his courtiers to participate in bizarre and grotesque revelries. He established the all-jesting, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, a mock institution dedicated to profanity, drinking, and debauchery, often making a mockery of the Orthodox Church. Imagine being a solemn dignitary, forced to participate in drunken, blasphemous rituals, all to please your larger-than-life czar. It was a test of loyalty, a bizarre hazing ritual for the Russian elite, and a quirky tidbit of his reign that shows a strange mix of intellectual curiosity and vulgarity. His relationship with his eldest son and heir, Alexei, was particularly tragic. Peter wanted Alexei to be a worthy successor, committed to his reforms, but Alexei was more traditional, introverted, and resistant to his father's modernizing zeal. The clash between them escalated into a bitter power struggle. Peter, paranoid about plots and convinced of Alexei's disloyalty, ultimately had his son arrested and tortured. Alexei died in prison in 1718, possibly from the torture or from illness exacerbated by it. Historians still argue about the precise circumstances of Alexei's death and Peter's culpability, but the event remains a dark stain on Peter's otherwise transformative legacy. It's the ultimate, horrific example of a father-son dispute. You can almost hear the booming laughter and the clinking of tankards in Peter the Great's court, a constant counterpoint to the sounds of hammers striking metal and new cities rising from the swamps. His personal excesses, while often shocking, were intertwined with his grand vision for Russia. He frequently hosted assemblies, Western-style social gatherings where men and women were expected to mingle freely, something unheard of in traditional Russian society. He forced nobles to attend these events, and woe betide anyone who failed to dance or drink enough. It was an attempt to force social modernization, a cultural revolution driven by a czar who believed firmly in learn by doing, even if doing involved copious amounts of alcohol and forced merriment. It's like being forced to go to a networking event, but if you don't enjoy yourself enough, you might get sent to Siberia. Peter's greatest achievement, and perhaps his most ambitious project, was the founding of St. Petersburg. He ordered its construction on marshy, inhospitable land near the Baltic Sea, declaring it Russia's window to Europe. The city was built with immense human cost, with tens of thousands of serfs and laborers dying from disease and harsh conditions during its construction. It was a monumental feat of engineering and human will, a deliberate rejection of old Muscovy and a symbol of Russia's new European aspirations. He literally picked up the capital and moved it, a bold, audacious move that few monarchs would even contemplate. His foreign policy was equally aggressive, focusing on securing access to the Baltic Sea. He waged the long and bloody Great Northern War against Sweden, then a dominant power. After years of brutal fighting, Russia emerged victorious, gaining significant territories and establishing itself as a major European power. This military success, while costly, cemented Peter's legacy as the architect of modern Russia, a nation capable of standing toe-to-toe with the West. Peter the Great died in 1725, leaving behind a vastly expanded, modernized, and centralized Russian empire. His reign was a whirlwind of progress and brutality, a testament to the power of one man's relentless will to transform his nation. He was a force of nature, a visionary whose reforms dragged Russia, often kicking and screaming, into the modern age, but whose personal character and methods were often horrifying. Historians still argue whether Peter's brutal means justified his transformative ends, or if his personal excesses ultimately undermined his long-term goals. Leaving the sprawling, ambitious empire of Peter the Great, you now float across the continent to the opulent, yet increasingly fragile, court of 18th-century France. The air here is heavy with the scent of perfume, powdered wigs, and the faint, sweet decay of an ancient regime teetering on the brink. Our next ruler is Louis XV, a king whose long reign was marked by growing decadence, mismanagement, and scandalous personal behavior, setting the stage for the dramatic collapse of the French monarchy. Born in 1710, Louis XV unexpectedly became king at the age of 5, after a series of tragic deaths in the royal family wiped out his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, the son King Louis XIV. Imagine being a tiny child, suddenly thrust onto the most magnificent throne in Europe, inheriting all the pomp, privilege, and immense, crushing responsibility. It's enough to make anyone feel a bit overwhelmed. His early years were governed by a regency, primarily by his granduncle, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, who managed France with some competence. As he grew older, Louis XV, initially dubbed Louis the Well-Beloved by his people, proved to be intelligent but also deeply introverted, indecisive, and increasingly bored by the affairs of state. He preferred hunting, women, and the quiet pursuits of his private apartments to the rigorous duties of kingship. This detachment from governance allowed various factions and favorites to gain undue influence at court, leading to inconsistent policies and widespread corruption. It's like a CEO who just wants to play golf all day, leaving the company to drift aimlessly while their subordinates fight amongst themselves. His personal life, however, was anything but quiet. Louis XV's reign became notorious for the immense influence of his mistresses, particularly Madame de Pompadour and later, Madame du Barry. These women, intelligent and ambitious, wielded enormous unofficial power, influencing ministerial appointments, foreign policy, and court patronage. Madame de Pompadour, a commoner by birth, rose to become one of the most powerful women in French history, a patron of the arts and a key advisor, despite never formally holding office. Imagine a powerful woman behind the throne, pulling strings and shaping destiny, all while the king is off hunting or pursuing other interests. It's a fascinating, if problematic, power dynamic. The king's pursuit of pleasure wasn't limited to his official mistresses. He maintained a secret residence at the Parc aux Cerfs, Deer Park, a notorious establishment where he kept a rotating retinue of young women. This became a symbol of the king's moral depravity and the immense cost of his personal indulgences. While royal mistresses were a long-standing feature of French court life, the perceived scale and cynical nature of the Parc aux Cerfs deeply alienated the public and fueled the growing perception of a dissolute monarchy. It was a bizarre, extravagant escape from the pressures of kingship, but it created an immense public relations problem for the crown. It's enough to make you think that perhaps absolute monarchs should have had better publicists. Financially, Louis XV's reign was a disaster. France was burdened by immense debt from previous wars, like the 7 Years' War, where France lost much of its colonial empire, including Canada and India, to Great Britain, and the king's extravagant court spending. His ministers repeatedly attempted to implement financial reforms, but they were consistently blocked by the entrenched interests of the nobility and clergy, who refused to pay taxes. Louis, lacking the will and determination to force through these necessary changes, allowed the financial crisis to fester, a ticking time bomb for the monarchy. This mainstream historical fact ultimately contributed significantly to the French Revolution. His foreign policy, too, was largely ineffective. France suffered significant defeats in the 7 Years' War, losing much of its colonial empire. The diplomatic reversal of alliances, where France allied with its traditional enemy Austria against Prussia and Great Britain, was largely unpopular and yielded few benefits. The king's indecisiveness and the shifting influences of his mistresses and advisors often led to contradictory and weak foreign policy decisions. As you continue your ethereal presence in the increasingly volatile court of Louis XV, you can almost feel the foundations of the monarchy beginning to crack under the weight of debt and public contempt. The scandalous affairs, the endless parties, and the military defeats all contributed to a growing disillusionment among the French people. The famous quote, often attributed to Madame de Pompadour, Après nous, le déluge, after us, the flood, perfectly encapsulates the irresponsible, short-sighted attitude that permeated the highest levels of power. It's like watching someone carelessly light a match in a room full of dynamite and then shrugging, "Not my problem." Louis XV was deeply unpopular by the end of his reign. He was seen as aloof, self-indulgent, and indifferent to the suffering of his subjects. The well-beloved moniker had long since faded, replaced by contempt and open mockery. He famously said, "For the good of the state? I don't care, it will last my time." This attitude, whether truly uttered or merely attributed, perfectly captures the fatal flaw of his reign, a profound lack of concern for the future of France. Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, largely unmourned by his people. His body was transported to St. Denis with little ceremony, a stark contrast to the grand funeral of his predecessor, Louis XIV. He left behind a kingdom deeply in debt, socially stratified, and politically unstable, ready to explode. His grandson, the well-meaning but ill-fated Louis XVI, inherited this powder keg, which would eventually ignite into the French Revolution. Historians still argue about the extent to which Louis XV's personal failings directly led to the revolution, or if broader societal forces were already at play. From the perfumed but crumbling elegance of pre-revolutionary France, you are now transported to the vast, wind-swept plains of late 16th century Russia, a land still reeling from the terrors of Ivan the Terrible and now facing new uncertainties. The air is thick with superstition, whispered conspiracies, and the desperate scramble for power. We are here to witness the reign of Boris Godunov, a czar who rose from humble origins to grasp the crown, only to be haunted by the specter of his past and the profound instability of his rule. Born around 1551, Boris Godunov was a member of a relatively minor boyar family. His rise to power was a testament to his ambition, intelligence, and political acumen. He gained influence at the court of Ivan the Terrible through his sister, Irina Godunova, who married Ivan's son and heir, Fifer Ivanovich. Boris proved himself a shrewd and capable administrator, quickly becoming one of Ivan's trusted advisors. This rise from relative obscurity to a position of immense power is a remarkable feat in itself, a testament to his political cunning. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, his mentally and physically frail son, Fifer I, ascended to the throne. Fifer was a pious but simple-minded ruler, utterly unsuited to governing the vast Russian Empire. This created another power vacuum, and Boris Godunov, as the brother-in-law of the new Tsar, quickly became the de facto regent, controlling all affairs of state. Imagine a puppet king, with the real power behind the throne being wielded by an incredibly astute and ruthless brother-in-law. It's a classic power play, executed with surgical precision. During Fifer's reign, Boris Godunov proved himself to be a highly effective ruler. He encouraged trade, strengthened ties with Western Europe, built new towns and fortresses, and even established the Patriarchate of Moscow, making the Russian Orthodox Church autocephalous, independent. He was a pragmatic and capable administrator, continuing some of Peter the Great's later reforms in a more measured way, laying foundations for Russia's future development. However, Boris's ascent was shadowed by a dark and persistent rumor, the death of Tsarevich Dmitry Ivanovich. Dmitry was Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Fifer's half-brother, and a potential claimant to the throne. In 1591, Dmitry, who was epileptic, died in Uglitch under mysterious circumstances, reportedly from a self-inflicted knife wound during an epileptic fit. A commission, led by Boris Godunov himself, investigated the death and concluded it was accidental. However, whispers immediately spread that Boris had ordered Dmitri's murder to clear his path to the throne. This single act, or at least the suspicion of it, would haunt Boris's entire reign. Historians still argue whether Boris was truly responsible for Dmitri's death or if it was a tragic accident he exploited for his own gain. The truth remains one of history's enduring mysteries. When Tsar Fifer died childless in 1598, the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries, came to an end. After some political maneuvering and a carefully orchestrated election by the Zemsky Sobor, National Assembly, Boris Godunov was elected Tsar. He was the first non-Rurikid ruler of Russia, a remarkable achievement for a man from a relatively minor noble family. Imagine ascending to the highest office in the land, a position historically reserved for a specific bloodline, purely through your own cunning and political skill. It's a true rags-to-riches story, but steeped in an undercurrent of public suspicion. Despite his genuine efforts to rule well, Boris's reign was plagued by a series of misfortunes that many believed were divine punishment for the alleged murder of Dmitri. Russia suffered from devastating famines between 1601 and 1603, which led to widespread suffering, starvation, and social unrest. Thousands died. The famines were so severe that there were reports of cannibalism. Boris tried to alleviate the suffering by distributing food and imposing price controls, but his efforts were largely ineffective against the scale of the disaster. These calamities seemed to confirm the public's darkest suspicions about his legitimacy. It's like a curse descending upon the land, directly linked in the public mind to the unatoned sin of the ruler. The ultimate challenge to Boris's rule came in the form of the false Dmitri. In 1603, a young man appeared claiming to be Tsarevich Dmitri, miraculously saved from the assassination attempt. This individual, whose true identity remains unknown, was almost certainly an impostor, but he gained significant support from Polish-Lithuanian nobles and disgruntled Russian Cossacks and peasants. He represented a rallying point for all those disaffected with Boris Godunov's rule, especially those who believed the Tsar was a usurper and a murderer. It was a bizarre, almost theatrical challenge to the throne, fueled by public superstition and deep political resentment. You continue to trace the uneasy path of Boris Godunov, a Tsar perpetually walking on eggshells, his rule undermined by public suspicion and the looming shadow of the false Dmitri. The impostor's forces advanced on Moscow, gaining momentum as more people, tired of the famine and believing in the true Tsar, flocked to his banner. Boris, for all his political acumen, found it increasingly difficult to rally support. The pervasive belief that he had murdered the legitimate heir eroded his authority, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. It was a bizarre, psychological warfare campaign, with a dead prince as the main weapon. In April 1605, just as the false Dmitri's forces were approaching Moscow, Boris Godunov suddenly died. The official cause was an apoplectic fit, but rumors of poisoning were rampant, though never confirmed. His young son, Fifer II, briefly succeeded him, but within weeks both he and Boris's widow were brutally murdered by the incoming forces loyal to the false Dmitri. The impostor then entered Moscow and was crowned Tsar, briefly fulfilling the prophecy he embodied. Boris Godunov's reign, born of ambition and shadowed by a dark secret, ended in tragedy, plunging Russia into the chaotic period known as the Time of Troubles, a period of civil war, famine, and foreign intervention. Historians still argue about the precise cause of Boris's death, and whether he was truly responsible for Dmitri's demise, but the popular perception of his guilt ultimately sealed his fate. From the turbulent, conspiratorial courts of Russia, you are once again drawn back to the grandeur and growing insanity of the Roman Empire, this time to a period of decline and self-indulgence that rivals the earlier excesses of Caligula and Nero. The air here smells of arena dust, sweat, and something faintly reptilian. Our next subject is Lucius Aurelius Commodus Antoninus, known simply as Commodus, an emperor who preferred the gladiatorial arena to the throne, blurring the lines between ruler and entertainer in the most bizarre ways imaginable. Born in 161 AD, Commodus was the son of the revered philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's 5 good emperors. Imagine growing up with a father known for his wisdom, stoicism, and dedication to duty, a man of profound intellect and moral rectitude. The expectation for Commodus, as his father's chosen successor, was immense. It's like being the child of a Nobel laureate and a saint, with everyone expecting you to also be a genius saint. That's a lot of pressure on a young man. Commodus was raised and educated to be an emperor, but he displayed little interest in the serious affairs of state. Instead, he was fascinated by gladiatorial combat, wild beast hunts, and chariot racing. His father, Marcus Aurelius, reportedly tried to steer him towards more appropriate imperial duties, but to little avail. This marked a stark departure from the adoptive succession system that had defined the 5 good emperors era, where rulers chose their most capable successor, not necessarily their biological kin. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, Commodus, at the age of 18, became emperor. His reign quickly devolved into a bizarre spectacle of self-indulgence, paranoia, and a disturbing obsession with the arena. He was handsome and physically strong, but also vain, impulsive, and utterly devoid of his father's philosophical wisdom or political acumen. He largely delegated the day-to-day administration of the empire to a series of corrupt favorites and powerful freedmen, who often ruled brutally and enriched themselves at the expense of the state. Commodus's most notorious eccentricity was his conviction that he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He would dress as the mythical hero, complete with a lion's skin and club, and demand to be worshipped as a living god. He even had statues of himself erected throughout Rome, depicting him as Hercules. Imagine your emperor strutting around in a lion costume, insisting everyone call him Hercules and worship him. It's truly a unique brand of delusion, a bizarre crossover episode between mythology and megalomania. His obsession with the gladiatorial games reached unprecedented levels. He didn't just attend the games, he participated in them. Commodus would enter the arena himself, fighting against gladiators, who were often armed with blunted weapons or ordered to submit, and wild animals, always emerging victorious, of course. He fought against disabled men, often killing them, and against wild beasts like lions, tigers, and bears, demonstrating his supposed prowess as a hunter and warrior. He charged the Roman state immense fees for his performances, bankrupting the treasury in the process. This was a grotesque abuse of power, turning the sacred institution of the emperorship into a grotesque circus act. You can almost hear the forced cheers of the Roman populace, a mix of fear and utter bewilderment. His decision to fight as a gladiator deeply offended the Roman elite. Gladiators were considered to be among the lowest members of Roman society, often slaves or condemned criminals. For an emperor to debase himself in such a manner was seen as a profound dishonor to the imperial office and a direct insult to the Roman people. It was like the leader of a superpower deciding to quit their job to become a professional wrestling heel, entertaining for some, but deeply unsettling for those who value stability and tradition. Historians still argue whether Commodus's participation was a genuine expression of his personal identity or a calculated, if perverse, attempt to connect with the common people. Commodus's paranoia and cruelty escalated as his reign progressed. He believed he was surrounded by conspirators and executed many prominent senators and officials on flimsy pretexts. His favored advisors, like Perennis and Cleander, were themselves ruthless and corrupt, further alienating the Senate and the Roman people. His behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous, mirroring the capricious nature of a Caligula, but with a unique gladiatorial twist. As you float through the final, frenzied years of Commodus's reign, the air in Rome feels perpetually charged with nervous energy, the kind that permeates a circus tent where the star performer is also the ringmaster, the lion tamer, and prone to spontaneous, deadly tantrums. He even renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and renamed the months of the year after his own titles. Imagine living in a city where every street sign and calendar entry reminds you of the emperor's utterly bizarre ego. It's the ultimate form of self-branding, but in the most profoundly unsettling way. His reign ultimately ended in a conspiracy involving his own inner circle. His mistress, Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Laetus, fearing for their own lives after being marked for execution, decided to act. On December 31, 192 AD, Marcia attempted to poison Commodus, but he vomited it up. Fearing exposure, they then sent a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. It was an ignominious end for an emperor who reveled in public spectacle, dying not in the arena, but by the hands of an assassin in his private quarters. His death plunged Rome into another period of civil war, known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Commodus's legacy is largely one of profound personal failure and a stark contrast to the stable, prosperous era of his father, marking the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. Historians still argue about the true extent of his mental illness versus his deliberate embrace of a populist, arena-focused persona. Finally, you journey to the opulent, yet increasingly somber, court of late 14th and early 15th century France. The scent of ancient stone and creeping dread hangs in the air, a kingdom grappling with not just war and internal strife, but the profound tragedy of a king lost to the labyrinth of his own mind. Our final subject is Charles VI of France, often known as Charles the Mad, whose long and tragic reign was a testament to the devastating impact of mental illness on a monarch and his realm. Born in 1368, Charles VI inherited the throne at the tender age of 11. France was still reeling from the devastating Hundred Years' War with England and the Black Death, a kingdom desperately in need of strong, stable leadership. His early years were marked by the regency of his ambitious and often squabbling uncles, who largely governed in their own self-interest, enriching themselves and destabilizing the realm through excessive taxation and infighting. Imagine being a child king, constantly pulled in different directions by powerful, selfish relatives, while your country bleed. It's not exactly a recipe for a stable future. For the first few years of his personal rule, Charles VI actually showed promise. He attempted to rein in his uncle's excesses, and he seemed genuinely interested in the welfare of his people. He even briefly earned the nickname, Charles the Beloved, for his efforts. But this period of stability was tragically short-lived. In August 1392, while riding with his army through a forest, Charles experienced his first major psychotic episode. A page accidentally dropped his lance, and the sudden noise, combined with the heat and his already stressed mental state, triggered a violent delusion. He attacked his own men, killing several of them, believing they were his enemies. He then rode wildly through the forest until he collapsed, utterly exhausted. This horrifying incident, known as the Bal d'Ardence, Ball of the Burning Men, was a public and terrifying manifestation of his deteriorating mental state. He often failed to recognize his own wife or children and would sometimes roam the palace corridors, convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. After this initial breakdown, Charles suffered from recurrent bouts of madness throughout the rest of his long reign. His episodes would range from periods of profound lethargy and catatonia, where he was unresponsive and barely moved, to periods of extreme agitation, violence, and bizarre delusions. He would refuse to bathe or change his clothes for months, becoming covered in vermin and emitting a terrible stench. Imagine the King of France, the epitome of medieval European royalty, living in such squalor, utterly lost within his own mind. It was a truly pitiful sight for his court and his kingdom. During his periods of lucidity, Charles was deeply distressed by his condition and the chaos it caused. He would attempt to resume his duties, but the episodes always returned, longer and more severe with each recurrence. This mental instability created a profound power vacuum at the heart of the French government. His uncles and other powerful nobles, particularly the Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy, constantly vied for control, their bitter rivalry escalating into a devastating civil war known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. This internal conflict, a direct consequence of the king's madness, further weakened France and left it vulnerable to English aggression. It's like watching two rival gangs fighting over control of a house, while the owner is too incapacitated to even realize what's happening. The English, under King Henry V, shrewdly capitalized on France's internal disarray. In 1415, they launched a devastating invasion, culminating in the Battle of Agincourt, a catastrophic defeat for the French. Taking advantage of the king's madness, Henry V coerced the French queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This treaty disinherited Charles VI's legitimate son, the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, and declared Henry V of England and his heirs as the rightful successors to the French throne. Imagine signing away your kingdom's future, your son's inheritance, all because your husband is mentally incapacitated and you're under immense pressure. It was a truly dark moment for France, and a mainstream historical fact that completely altered the course of the 100 Years' War. Historians still argue about the extent of Queen Isabeau's complicity and the pressures she faced in signing this devastating treaty. The bizarre nature of Charles VI's delusions, particularly the glass delusion, is a quirky or fringe tidbit of his reign that illustrates the specific manifestations of his madness. While medical understanding was limited at the time, his symptoms are now widely recognized as consistent with various severe psychiatric conditions. The French court, desperate for a cure, tried everything from exorcisms to harsh physical treatments, but nothing worked. Charles VI died in 1422, a broken man and a king largely forgotten by his people, overshadowed by the ongoing war and the chaos he left behind. His death reignited the 100 Years' War, as his son, the Dauphin, refused to accept his disinheritance and fought to reclaim his throne. The reign of Charles VI stands as a stark and tragic example of how the personal suffering of a monarch can reverberate through an entire nation, plunging it into decades of conflict and despair. You've journeyed through the unsettling corridors of power tonight, witnessed the personal quirks and terrifying cruelties of kings who ruled with little regard for convention or compassion. From Caligula's divine delusions to Vlad's impaling forests, and from Henry VIII's marital guillotine to Leopold's monstrous rubber empire, each monarch offered a unique, often chilling, glimpse into the darker side of absolute power. As you now begin to drift away from these historical echoes, let the images soften, the harsh sounds of the past fade into a gentle hum. Feel the cool air settle around you, perhaps the whisper of a fan or the quiet rustle of leaves outside your window. The weight of these stories, heavy with human folly and suffering, can now recede. The world of mad kings and perverse power is far behind you, tucked away in the annals of history, a lesson learned, a tale told. Close your eyes. Let your mind clear. All is calm, all is quiet. The shadows of past reigns dissipate with the last lingering thoughts, replaced by the comforting darkness of your room. Rest easy now, knowing you are safe, far from the whims of tyrants and the echoes of their twisted deeds.